Build Right is the educational division of Sparkbox, working to inspire and empower a web built right. For more information about Build Right or to have one of our workshops at your company or event, check out buildright.io. If you'd like to have Sparkbox help you make your web better, visit csparkbox.com. You're watching Tim Kadlec's Build Right Maker Series on performance budgets from April 23rd of 2015. The Build Right Maker Series is brought to you by the folks at Sparkbox and these generous sponsors. DataYard, performance-driven cloud hosting for kick-ass websites and applications. Campaign Monitor, a simple and elegant email marketing software for business. Shopify, a hosted, theme-based e-commerce platform. Harvest, simple time tracking, professional invoicing, powerful reporting software. Additional thanks to our secondary and giveaway sponsors for their help in making the Build Right Maker Series possible.
I am super excited about this. I like to talk about performance a lot. I like to talk about performance budgets a lot. I've never had an opportunity to just focus on performance budgets, the process, and kind of lay it out from start to finish in this detail before. When Ben first brought this up, I was actually a little nervous that, what, we have 3 hours to go? But it turns out that we have a lot of stuff that has come out in the last, I think 2012 is when the topic first came up. So it come out in the last 3 years. So the performance budget process is much better defined by now, which is fantastic. And like Ben said, if you guys have questions, ask questions throughout the thing. Don't hesitate to interrupt me. I'm also going to stop at a few places just to ask and encourage in case anybody hasn't. In my experience, you'll get the most out of it if you're not afraid to jump in with things that are relevant to you or your company. That's what the goal is that everybody walking away from here can go back to their companies and start doing the performance budgets within their own organization or own agency right away. So whatever you have to ask to get to that point, please do. There's no such thing as a silly question when it comes to this. Trust me, I've heard them all. It's great. In fact, along that vein, right away, is there anything that, if you're sitting there right now when you signed up and you said, okay, if I learn this thing at the performance budget workshop, it'll be worth, the price of admission. What would that thing be? Does anybody have any specific questions they want to make sure that we get out in the next 3 hours? Yes.
Just one thing in general. I read a lot about performance, and some of the articles and posts I see mention the part where the developer tells the designer or the designers, all right, you have a $100K budget for, I'm going to say fonts.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a lot. Images. My question is, where this $100K come from? What's the basis for it?
Fantastic. We will definitely cover that. Definitely. Anything else we want to make sure we get out? Yeah.
Just scalability.
Scalability. Yeah, we talked a little bit, you and I, about your scalability issues at Nationwide, and I got to say, I'm going to attempt to address those things. But that's a pretty massive scale. So there's going to be wrinkles in the experience, but we're definitely going to talk about some things that will help with that. So, and then you have to let everybody know after, how that went at a company with that sort of scale. Yes.
When it's appropriate to push something to the server side or to handle the client side, like sorting a large table or things like that. Okay,
we might touch on some of that stuff in the first three, but that also, if we don't get into that in detail, bring that up in the second half for sure, and we can go into that. Anything else?
Some tactics for communicating to management or to the clients who are non-technical as part of the planning process and saying, these are some technical terminologies and this is how it relates to you.
Mm-hmm.
How do you speak their language from a technical perspective?
It's hugely important. The whole budget process fails if you can't, get buy-in from everybody else that's involved. So we're definitely going to touch on that from a few different approaches. We'll definitely talk about that. That's perfect. Yes?
Kind of ideas for tracking performance through different development environments when they're not really the same, network and system landscape. How do you compare a dev server that's local to the latency and things you might get from something served at a data center
Yeah,
and account for the differences?
it's a great question. Okay, I think we'll talk about that when we get to, if there's going to be a few places where that is going to touch on that topic. So feel free at that point to jump into if you want to dig in a little bit more specifically, but we've definitely got some things that'll cover that area. All right? All right. Well, if you, like I said, anything else that comes up, or if there's anything you want to call me out on, like you disagree with, feel free to. That's fine. That's A-okay in my book. You guys you're here for the next 3 hours listening to me, so I want you to enjoy it. The live stream people have an advantage. They can just hit mute. You have to suffer through. Haha. All right. So performance. I talk a lot about performance. I write a lot about performance. It's something that I've been really into actually probably for, I think it was when Steve Sodders first came out with High Performance Websites, the first book from O'Reilly. I read it and I latched onto it, and from that moment in, I was kind of sucked in. I don't know why exactly. I think it was partly because it felt cool, but I think partly like there's a little bit of maybe there's a little bit of a racer in me, and I just like the idea of continually going faster and faster and drilling down, and it's nice to have that concrete thing. But for a very long time, I and a lot of other people, we focus a lot on this technical stuff, right? We have all these rules, the rules that came out of YSlow and things like that, these techniques that you're supposed to do in order to make sure that performance happens. And these are great, and they're massively important, and we should absolutely be doing things like this and looking into them. But one thing that kind of became clear over the last few years is that even though we were starting to discuss this stuff a lot more, and we were starting to get better tools around this, and it was starting to make its way into more conferences and more articles, we weren't really making a lot of progress. And the reason for that isn't because we're bad developers or bad designers. The reason for that is because what I found is that performance largely, like getting it done, isn't necessarily a technical issue. It's a cultural issue. It's an issue that goes much more deeply rooted than just the dotting your I's and crossing your T's. Because what happens is all of this stuff that sits underneath it from a cultural perspective is actually what influences what can get done over the course of a project. A lack of performance actually reflects a lack of planning. If we're not deliberate and intentional about it, it's not going to happen. And this became also very clear to me when I was talking to a friend who did a responsive site. This is very early on in the responsive days, and he had worked on a site for a large food company. And we were kind of exchanging emails talking about this, and he knew that I was really into performance and that I was kind of nuts on that. And so he kind of hedged it a little bit in the email, and he said, it's a little heavy, not obnoxiously, but a little bit, enough that he felt like he needed to explain it. So he said, I doubt anyone really wants to release a site that doesn't perform well. It's just a product of not being afforded the luxury of time and top-down pressure. And at first glance, this can feel a little bit like a cop-out, like, come on, you've got all the technical stuff in place, you should be able to just, do this, compress these things, throw a sprite here, whatever you got to do. But if you think about it and if you're honest with yourself, I don't think that it is a cop-out. I think this is something we can all relate to. So I want to start by telling you a story of when I sucked really bad on a project with this. And then you're going to wonder why you're listening to me, but that's fine. I can just destroy all credibility I have right at the beginning and sets the bar really low. So one of the early responsive sites I worked on was with a large company. It was a really brilliant team of designers and developers, really talented team, and we were really excited about this. We jumped in and we were going to build this responsive redesign. We were going to do it the right way. We were taking all the steps up front. We had talked to management, and we're like, we should make a fast, responsive site. And they're like, yes, fast is a good word. Let's do it. And everybody was kind of behind this, and people were saying fast is just one of the things. It was just one of the components of what we were going to build. We kind of took that for granted, I think. And so we set out to build this, and we set out to build something that was beautiful and robust and fast, and that's how we described the project. And there was no reason to think it wasn't going to happen because it was a great team, brilliant people. It didn't take long for things to start going haywire, though. Early on in the project, the designers and the developers, we lived in our little silos. We weren't doing working together very closely. In the design team, and one of their early comps, created something that was beautiful, but management got a peek at it before we did, and management fell in love with this thing, rightfully so. It was gorgeous. It was immersive and just full of colors and vivid imagery. It was beautiful and wonderful. And by the time that the development team saw it, there really wasn't any going back. Like, management is already like hook, line, and sinker on this. They were planning like advertising campaigns around this, like using the same sorts of field that they were seeing there. It was just, they had bought into this so hard, which was a problem because it was apparent that there were going to be some real serious issues. You know, certain things in terms of functionality just seemed like they would be very difficult to pull off on the web. But in terms of performance as well, I mean, there were full bleed image carousels all over the place, and you know, just images left and right. Actually, there were multiple carousels, if I remember right. It was just, there was a lot of things going on. It was going to be very difficult to do in a way that was performant. But again, we were a smart team, and we felt pretty confident in our abilities, so we weren't going to, like, you know, we weren't going to bow out of this. We felt pretty good. We're just going to have to buckle down. But then strike two came, which was that because of these sort of advertising schemes that they came up with, they decided to move the launch date up by, you know, I don't know, about a third of the way. And nobody pushed back on the scope of the project. So now we were going to be doing the same thing in, you know, 2/3 of the time we originally had allotted, and it was going to be this extremely complex layout. That had a tremendous impact on the way that we started talking and thinking about the project. We went from building something that was beautiful and robust and fast to building something that was beautiful and done on time. That became the way we described everything. So you had, you know, whenever you got to a point where you had a feature, you had two ways to do it. You could build this feature in a way where you were making sure to take the steps necessary to make it perform very well, thorough testing and all that sort of thing. But you were probably going to miss your tight deadline, or you just get it out the door on time, and then you were like, we'd come back later and kind of touch it up. You can imagine which we did, right? You didn't want to upset everybody. If you spend a lot of time in the performance community, you hear this: the pre-optimization is the root of all evil, which is true, you know, to some extent. If you're not testing ahead of time to find out where you should be optimizing and what the value is of that optimization, you can waste a lot of time and money on something that doesn't matter. But I'd argue that just as often post-optimization is the root of all evil, because it never happens. You know, we say we're going to come back and fix it, but we never do. If it wasn't a priority up front, why is it going to be a priority later on down the line? You know, we can't bank on that shift. And this ended up being the problem on this project. We built it, we got it done, and probably about a month before launch, we stood back and we kind of looked at what we had done. And we realized that this thing was awful. It was fat, it was slow, it was sluggish, it was everything that we said we were not going to do. We set up to build something amazing, and we had gotten an outcome a little bit more similar to this. Now, we had a lot of pride in ourselves and a lot of pride in our abilities, so we were like, we can't ship this. You know, nobody's ever going to talk to us again. So for the last month, we busted. We worked endless hours over the weekends. It was very stressful. There was crying. I wasn't me. I just want to make that clear. But there was crying, there was anger. It was a really stressful environment. But we got through thanks to a lot of this during the days and a lot of this during the nights. And by launch, it was better, but it wasn't fast. It was still not anything we would proudly claim that we had, you know, done a great job from a performance perspective. We had reduced the issues a little bit, but not fixed it, and you know, they just ran too deep. So the site launches. The initial reaction is really positive. Everybody's like, it looks amazing. And then, like, within a couple days, you started hearing from users all the feedback that we kind of knew was going to be coming. Like, this is really kind of slow when you do this, or this, why is this so janky when you move between these items on the carousel? And you know, all those performance issues started to rear their heads, the things that we knew were already there. And suddenly, everybody who had not really paid as close attention throughout the project to performance started to get really interested in it again. See, performance is a lot like plumbing in that way, right? It's fundamentally important, it's crucial, but nobody really talks about it until it's broken and the toilet's backed up and spraying water everywhere, right? It's hard to get people to pay attention. And that's the same thing with performance sometimes in those scenarios. It's an invisible thing. When performance is good, you don't notice. And when it's bad, frankly, we don't always notice because we have incredible machines and we have incredible connection speeds. We work in an environment that is not at all reflective of the environment that most of our users are using. So it's very easy to miss those performance problems if you're not looking for them. End of the story, we ended up having to redo the entire thing. We did an entire redesign, an entire rebuild, twice the budget, basically. It was an absolute disaster. Second time went really well, though. I'll say that. I don't recommend that strategy. If you go back and do the build something, then build it again kind of thing, most bosses frown on that, as it turns out.
Did you have to sacrifice some of the beauty?
No, we did not. We had to change it. So we had to play, we didn't necessarily have as much in terms of all the full bleed carousels and stuff, but it was still fairly image heavy. It was still beautiful. It had a slightly different aesthetic to it, but it looked great. It looked very sharp. We just got better at working together as a team, design and development together, with performance prioritized throughout, and that influenced our design decisions early on. And so the result was something that looked great, but also performed very well. So we didn't have to, we had to change the aesthetic a little bit, but we didn't necessarily have to, ditch the beautifulness. I think it still turned out excellent.
Was the marketing campaign impacted?
Yeah, it was impacted. I mean, so they got to do it, but then they had to, kind of redo it and because they're one of their big pitches was one of the first companies of that type to be responsive, and the press releases things going on, and then within a few months they were they had to kind of re-release their stuff. So it was kind of an awkward thing, but it worked out all right. Everybody survived in the end. This is fairly typical. I think that what I've talked to is I like to think, at least, that it's not just me who's been in a situation like this. Maybe you've never had to entirely do a rebuild, but I think most people I talk to can, kind of relate to a decision or a situation where they wanted to build something and they set out to do it amazing, and it just didn't work out in the end. There were time shifting, deadline shifting, priority shifting, and they just never quite got to where that is. And the problem with this is that performance is so very fundamental and crucial to the user experience. If you think about what it means when you're on the web, the entire experience with the web is made up of interactions, right? You click a button, you submit a form, you scroll up and down a page, you are constantly moving, and the content on your screen is constantly shifting. All of those interactions are constantly taking place, constantly shaping your experience of what it feels to use that website and that web page, and how those interactions perform, whether you notice it or not, has a tremendous impact on how you react with that web page or how you react to that website, and at the end of the day, how effective it is for the business. There's 1,000,001 case studies. We're not going to get into all of them because that would be 3 hours of me just ranting about stats, and that would be really, really super annoying and boring. But I do want to throw a few out there because this is the sort of thing, when you were talking about how do you position this to other people within the organization, one of the things to get the early buy-in that can be really effective is to speak their language. For me, as a developer, if you come up to me and you're like, hey, Tim, we should do this, and if we do this, we're going to cut our speed index by 200, I'm like, yeah, that's awesome, because that's the kind of stuff, I get really excited about that. If you go to marketing and you're like, hey, we need to do this so that we can cut our speed index by 200, they're going to be like, the heck are you talking about? Nobody knows what that means, for one, but why do I care? What does it mean for me? So one of the things is to sprinkle a little bit of those stats, tying it back to things that matter, finding out what matters to the people within the organization that you need to sell performance to. Maybe that's bounce rate, maybe that's revenue, and finding ways to just show them that if we do these performance things, you're going to see an impact on this, which is one of the things that helps define the success of your role. That speaks to people. So just a few of those. Walmart worked on improving the performance of their site, and they found out that for every 100 milliseconds they cut off load time, which is a super minor amount, they saw a 1% increase in revenue. 1% doesn't sound like a lot, but think about the scale that Walmart's operating on. That's a lot of money every year for 100 milliseconds. And also think about, frankly, the duration. That's not very much time to be able to directly tie back to an actual tangible benefit from a business perspective. This actually lines up. Amazon had pretty much the exact same stats, I think, and I think there's one other company that came up with the same thing. So this 100 milliseconds to 1% revenue is a pretty well-defined rule by now. Along a similar vein, Yahoo found out that for every 400 milliseconds they shaved off load time, they saw an increase of about 9% in traffic. Firefox, the Mozilla folks, they did this. This was a few years back, but they did a rebuild of their page and took 2.2 seconds off the load time, and they saw a 15.4% increase in conversions in terms of who downloaded Firefox from the landing page, which I can't remember the exact amount, but it was a lot of money, or a lot of value, a lot of increased downloads that they had as a result of this. That's a big conversion increase. Etsy, Lara Hogan loves to talk about this one. They added 160 kilobytes of images to their mobile site, which, let's be honest, that could be just one hero image in many cases. And they found that there was a 12% increase in bounce rate from 160K of images. That's not a lot. That's like 1 or 2 images, and you're already seeing a huge decrease.
That was their mobile site?
That was the mobile. Yep. It's not pretty.
So the abbreviated summary to the marketing person that wants to throw in a really cutesy picture of something is like, this is the impact you want to introduce here. Is that you want to drive away potential revenue.
Well,
By doing this.
and you want to be careful about how you position that, though, because you don't necessarily want to. It can certainly come off as abrasive or confrontational. Remember that I loved when I talked about my friend's email and what he said about nobody wants to build a poor performing site. That goes just as well for marketing. There's nobody who intentionally sets out and says, you know what I want to do? I want to screw up our website today. And there's nobody who does that. Or if they do, they're maybe somebody who's got a personal vendetta against the company and does one of those epic, I just screwed up the website, dropping the mic and walking out kind of a thing. But otherwise, there's nobody who does that. So if marketing or somebody else is like, hey, we want to do this from an imagery perspective, we want to get this carousel on there, they have a reason for why that is. And maybe they think that is going to increase engagement. Maybe they think that that's going to just provide a better vision of the brand or whatever it happens to be. So you want to approach it carefully. You don't want to make it a negative thing, but you do want to point out that, that you're right. That would be a nice visual treatment. It looks great. Here's what we need to be concerned about. Here's a potential pitfall of this. Adding additional weight to the site could potentially actually reduce our traffic. And then maybe sprinkle for example, Etsy found out that this did this, or whatever it is that ties to their particular metric. If they don't buy in at that point still, if you can't get them to sell that, one of the things you can always do is fall back on an experiment. If you can get to, Etsy is huge on this. Etsy experiments on everything. They've built their own tool that does this. It's extensive. You don't have to get quite that involved, but that's a decent way of doing it, is throw out a little A/B test or try to do it on a subset of your users initially and tie it back to the analytics and actually watch the impact. I know that even that can be a difficult thing to sell, but sometimes it's easier than just outright saying no, we're not going to put the carousel there because of this. So if the business metrics don't get through, that's a way to fall back. And also have patience, because it doesn't change overnight. The performance culture stuff does not change overnight. If you go home and you start doing this stuff right now inside of your organization, and maybe there isn't a precedence for that, or it's just not something that people have bought into, you're not going to have everybody bought in next week. It doesn't work that way. It's going to be a pretty long process. Cultural issues are significantly harder to change or to fix and address than technical issues. Much, much harder. There's just much more at play. Humans are involved, and humans are messy.
In a case like this, and other cases, where we just talk about the actual size, is this a density increase, or is this number of images displayed on the screen increase?
Oh, what was their experiment exactly?
Yeah, 'cause I mean that's the difference, right? It's like the density of the image, like 96 dpi, or
Yeah, my understanding of the experiment is it was additional images.
Okay.
It wasn't like taking the image and blowing it up. Now, in other cases here, like some of the, like the Google thing here where they did 500 milliseconds and saw a decrease in 25% of searches, that was more like just adding artificial weight to the pages. So there are companies, and I think Etsy does some of this too. In fact, Etsy, I know they've done some of this, and I know that Facebook does a lot of this. Facebook did a thing where they, for their scrolling performance, they purposely cut the frame rate of their scrolling by half. So you had significantly jagged or scrolling on purpose. It was artificial. It wasn't anything. They were just like, here, we're just going to slow everything down to see what it's like, which is kind of nuts if you think about it. Like, good luck selling that to your organization. But so there's some of it is artificial. In their case, it was legitimately, it was extra images, is the way I understood it. Yeah, so Google, 25% reduction in searches. An interesting thing about Google's studies, not this one, I don't think. I think it was another one. But they did this artificial delay, saw people were less engaged in their site. When they took away the artificial delay, the people remained less engaged for a long time after. It took a while for that to return back to normal use. That initial experience like left a bad taste in their mouth, and even when it was fixed, it was still in the back of their heads and causing them to change the way they interacted with the site. It took a while for that return to normal, which is why it's also so sad when performance isn't prioritized up front, because the damage gets done as soon as the site's launched and used. From a cost perspective, which is an interesting thing, Netflix turned on gzip, which compresses all the sort of text content and textual content. And it's a big thing. They saw a 43% reduction in their bandwidth bill by just enabling gzip on there. Now, that's certainly on their scale and the type of content they're doing, but that's pretty remarkable. On a more general study, the Aberdeen Group, this is a consulting group, did this thing where they put a 1-second decrease in page load time because they wanted to see what happens to sites that are 1 second slower. They saw an 11% decrease in page views. They saw a 16% decrease in customer satisfaction. They saw a 7% decrease in conversions. If your site's pulling in $100,000 a day, that means you just lost $2.5 million over the course of a year from 1 second on your page. These things are things that don't do what I did. Don't like bombard people with a long list of stats if you're trying to sell them. Pick and choose. You don't want their eyes to glaze over. But sprinkling in, like backing up data and sprinkling in these case studies can go a long way towards helping you to make your case when you're talking to marketing or management or whoever it happens to be. Because these are the things that speak to them. $2.5 million speaks to someone. 2 seconds or 1 second might not. So in summary, you can tie performance back to just about everything. Just about anything on your site that matters from a business perspective. There's probably a case study out there that shows you somehow that performance is good, improving performance has a benefit for that. That was a very quick look at just a few case studies. There's a lot more out there if you dig. If you look through Guy Pajarni, and I'll get the links here. I don't have them actually in the deck, but I'll get them to Ben or somebody so we can get those out there or tweet them afterwards. Guy Pajarni has a page where he's been tracking case studies. Tammy Everts talks a lot about performance metrics from a business perspective. And we're also just recently started a podcast with Katie. Katie, say hi. Which is all about culture of performance, and we're trying to collect a lot of stats and metrics through that too when we talk to people. So there's a lot of different places you can go to find this sort of thing if you want to find information that is going to be helpful for you to make your case. So that was a quick 101 in terms of like the impact of performance, and that was a really slow transition. Does anybody have any questions up to this point about talking about this stuff, talking about the metrics? How do you present it? Any of the sprinkling in there? Otherwise, we're going to jump to the performance budgeting stuff now. Any concerns, anything you want to disagree with? Yeah?
What about someone that's at a bank that you have to get on and you have to pay this bill, so load time might not be an issue? How would you pitch that to a business?
So it's interesting. So a bank where somebody has to get online, has to pay the bill, so load time might not be an issue. You know, so the interesting thing there is that it is an issue. It just depends on from what perspective. So you may not, yes, if I use, do you work at a bank? What bank, can I ask?
It's Alliance Data, so it's
Okay.
a bank-ish.
Is it super
company.
fast?
Yeah, they do.
Yeah, okay. I don't know. US Bank, let's say US Bank. I have no idea if they're fast or slow, and if anybody's here listening, I'm not trying to offend you or US Bank or anything like that. I just want a bank to use it as an example. So US Bank, let's say I use US Bank. I have to get online, I have to pay my bill. That's the only way I can do it. Yes, I'm going to do it. And so you're not going to necessarily see a reduction in like conversions of bill payments or anything like that. What you are going to be able to measurably detect if you actually do any sort of surveys or anything, I guarantee it's going to impact user satisfaction. Whether or not they are aware that it's the performance, you know, some people might be, some are not. If you search Twitter one time, just every once in a while I like to do this, like every couple weeks I just search for slow site or something like that. And it's amazing how many people, non-web developers, non-web designers, are tweeting things about how horribly slow something is, some service is, and how much they hate that, and they wish they, you know, I used to have a really great couple of them, like one person tweeting specifically that they were going to stop using that company if they didn't fix things because they're wasting their time. Another person's like, you're making it really hard for me to give you my money because this is so obnoxiously slow. So you may not be able to get them to vocalize in the survey that it's because it's slow, although I'd be surprised if a few people didn't say so. But if you do like a survey, do some performance improvements, do another test to check on user satisfaction, user approval of the company, it definitely impacts their perspective of the brand. There are actually studies, 2 existing studies on that, about the impact that performance has on how a person perceives that company, and how many of those people are willing to then ditch that company at some point in the future because they want to go somewhere that's going to be faster and less painful. So it still contributes to the experience, even if it doesn't necessarily mean that people stop paying bills. Yeah, no problem.
So so you sort of listed all of the different types of analytics that you can, how you measure, or, bounce rate, all those things. So I mean, is there, if the company isn't terribly strong, and that sounds like a very purposeful test, right? That we're going to measure these items from this time.
It is.
And so I'm just trying to think of the challenges that we might have around, like we sort of decentralized analytics, right? So I mean, it's these smaller organizations like Etsy that they have the ability to. So are there tools or best practices? Because I mean, I would hate to put that responsibility in the wrong hands, and you get a false report back, right? Because you don't really know what you're doing. So it seems like you need to have an analytics person that actually knows what they're doing and understands that for 1 week we're going to measure these things and be able to analyze that data properly so that you get correct data back.
Yeah.
Is this on like all through just Google Analytics, or is it?
I mean, it could be as simple as that if you wanted to. I mean, and if you don't have something set up, I say go ahead and start there. Start with the simplest thing to get you doing and get you starting to test with these things. And there's going to be a learning curve on that. Maybe your first few experiments, you come to conclusions that 3 months later you discover were slightly off for some reason. I mean, some of the data is going to be pretty self-evident, but there's going to be other things that, especially if you're just getting into A/B testing, you may very well make some A/B test decisions based on a sample size that doesn't actually, it doesn't have statistical significance, and you don't know that up front. But that's all part of this is what I'm talking about when I say that culture is a long haul thing. A lot of that just comes with doing it and learning with it and getting more comfortable with it. And as you do, you get better at it and you get to understand and recognize patterns better and how to set things up. And I don't think that Etsy, even Lara has admitted a million times what a privilege it is to work at a company that has that sort of culture, that sort of experimentation just built into the organization is not something most of us have. And it's not something that you're going to get overnight. So we don't all get to do things like, let's just shove a bunch of extra images on there and see if we can slow things down. That's nuts. We don't get to pull that off. But you can start somewhere. You can start with what you do have, your simple tools, and as you start to do those and you start to build a case around those, then you can start to invest more into it. Once you start doing a few of those early things and start to see some benefits that you might be able to track tied back to your analytics, then start, looking into investing into better tooling for that, or more experiments, or whatever it is, and start to build that culture as a slow thing. It's not, sadly, it's not like a jump head first in and boom, you're doing it, and we're all talking at velocity or whatever about our case studies, unfortunately. So I would start with the simplest solution that gets you doing it and gets you trying it out and getting people used to that sort of thing. Yes, sir.
It seems like so far the metrics that we've talked about that affect users are like basically the perceived page load time, the first time to that above the full render. Do you have any evidence that other performance things really affect users? Like, if you're loading a bunch of images async later, it's not really changing their first perception, but it's using up more bandwidth.
Yes, yeah.
If your JavaScript is slow to execute and going from one interaction to the other, do you think those kind of things apply the same, or is it a different category of?
No, they apply. So some of those things actually, like the Etsy adding weight, doesn't necessarily impact the perceived. I'd have to see their exact experiment, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it impacted the perceived performance of things. They could have had those images sort of further down the page and not actually change how things loaded. As it is, there are so many case studies that are tied to weight, because for a long time we focused on weight and page load as the two primary holy grail metrics. There's so many case studies tied to it. So things beyond perception certainly impact. We're going to get into some of that stuff a little bit later when we start to get into timings and how people perceive those timings. So I think we'll cover a little bit of that, but I should shove more in there. But if you come up afterwards too, and just give me your email, I can send you some. And like I said, I'll get the links to the lists and stuff to Ben so we can get those out. But there's plenty of stuff out there that shows that it's not just perception, but the weight and things like that impact as well. Perception's certainly the biggest though. Certainly the biggest. It's because it's the most apparent to people. Anything else? All right. So let's jump on to performance budgets. If you've built the case that performance matters, you can still find yourself in a situation like I did on that project where we were all invested in that, yeah, performance makes sense and we want to make something fast. But we left it at that. We left it at fast. And the problem with fast is a relative term. Fast to me is not necessarily fast to you or fast to your manager. It's a totally different, it has a different meaning, what we perceive as fast based on which one of us is talking about it. And so I think it helps to get a lot more concrete about things, and that's where the performance budget comes in. Now, for anybody who's not hasn't been, isn't that familiar with the technique, a performance budget is simply, it's a performance goal that you use to guide to design in the development of a site or a page. For example, you may decide that your budget is that your pages are going to be visually complete in 4,000 milliseconds or less. That would be a performance budget. And then you would use that to guide how you build that site and how you design that site to make sure that all of your pages come in under that budget. Like I said, the biggest benefit, in my opinion, is you're getting concrete about something. It's a tangible point of reference that you guys can talk about when you're talking about how do we make this fast and wanting to make the site fast. You're not just saying that, you're saying, okay, remember, we need this to be in less than or equal to 4,000 milliseconds. We need this to be visually complete. It gives everybody a common point of reference to discuss. That's the main benefit. It's a familiar point for people to talk about. There's a lot of nuance to it. For example, what metrics should you use for a performance budget? There's a ton of different performance metrics you could use. We're going to look at some web page test stuff. If anybody's not familiar with web page test, anybody not familiar with web page test? Okay, that's fine. Web page test is awesome. Web page test is the most ridiculous free tool ever. Why it's free, I have no idea. For the power that it gives you, it's incredible. It's freely available. You can do a private instance that you have to set up yourself, which would also be free. Unfortunately, the installation can be a little bit of a pain. It's not the easiest thing to do, so a lot of people just rely on the public instance. But you basically can test a URL through a number of different scenarios, through different servers, through different network types, on different devices, different browsers. And you get a detailed report at the end, like this one for the Maker Series page for this event. That gives you things about load time, start render, all of these different metrics that we're going to get into some of these in a little bit. You also get a waterfall view below it, which we'll show in just a little while, that shows like how everything actually loaded on the page. It gives you a checklist versus the optimizations and some grades, which you can see, so like simple things that you should be paying attention to. It's got a command line interface, so you can integrate it into a whole bunch of tools, and we'll talk about some of those. It's a fantastic resource, and we're going to kind of use this for some of our analysis going forward on this. So getting into the types of metrics, I loosely categorize them into categories I completely made up, because they helped me. So I say that there are 4 basic types, and you can disagree because this is not a rule. This is just my own made-up thing. There's quantity-based metrics, rule-based metrics, milestone timings, and then speed index, which I gave its own little thing because I have a soft spot in my heart for speed index. And they each have different pros, cons, and things that they're good at, things they could use a little help on. Quantity-based metrics. These are metrics related to the quantity of something, quantity of requests or bytes or whatever it is from a page. This is something that we have traditionally focused on quite a bit. So how many requests does a page make? How much weight does the page have? These things are very clearly reported inside of web page test over here, where you can see there's 30 requests, 771 kilobytes for the Maker Series page. You can get those in your browser tools. You can get those in just about, no, not just about. I can't imagine any single performance tool that doesn't report this stuff. This is pretty basic and easy to get access to. Quantity-based has some serious benefits. For one, it's a very easy thing to understand, right? Communicating to somebody that a website makes 30 requests doesn't take very much effort for you to explain what that means, or that it is 500 bytes, 500 kilobytes, 500 bytes, you guys are doing good, 500 bytes, kilobytes of weight. That's something that's pretty easy to say and explain what that means. It's also very clear to tie to design and development decisions. If I'm going to add a 100K carousel script, I can tell very clearly what that's going to do to, it's going to add another request, and it's going to add another 100K towards my 500K budget, whatever it happens to be. It's very, very easy to use, very easy to communicate, very easy to track. The problem with quantity-based metrics, what they're not so good at, is that they are not very indicative of the user experience at all. Filament Group, who you should be absolutely paying attention to anyway because they do so many brilliant things. Very recently, I guess this was last week, Scott Gell wrote this post, "More weight doesn't mean more weight," where he was making this point. And what they did is they took the wired responsive site, which is like 8 to 9 megs, somewhere in there, and without touching any of that, without changing the weight, just changing the way things were loading and how, in what order and things like that, and how things were coming in, this is the result. The top strip is a web page test strip of wired before they touched anything. So 8 to 9 megabytes, no tweaking in terms of the order. The bottom strip is the exact same size, same weight, but they've changed things so that the perceived performance is better, and it loads in a way that it gets things onto the screen a lot quicker. If all you're relying on is quantity-based metrics, you have a remarkable difference here between I think the bottom experience, we can all agree, is a lot better, and it gets things out to people a lot quicker. But if you're tracking just requests or weight, it's actually not really changing anything. Like, those metrics have pretty much stayed constant between the two. So that's the risk of quantity-based alone, is that there's almost no connection to the user experience directly. That sounds more negative than it is. We're going to get to these metrics later. I think all of them have a purpose and all have something you can use, but it's something you should be aware of when you come to that sort of a timing. And if we want to view it this way, you've got the user, the visitor, and we've got this sort of continuum of what's close to the user and what's far away. Quantity-based metrics go somewhere over here. They're pretty far removed from what the user is actually feeling when they're interacting with your site. The next category would be rule-based. So these are things based on adherence to a set of rules or guidelines or checklists. So things like we saw the web page test had the checklist of scores. Page speed insights is a fantastic tool that does a very similar thing. So if you run it through this online or through the command line, you get a list of things that a grade, and you get a list of things that you might want to fix both for mobile and desktop to improve the performance. You can also run this right directly within the Chrome browser as an audit. And again, it will give you certain things to do, like tell you you should remove the unused CSS, you should optimize the order of style sheets. It gives you a very clear guideline, or very clear roadmap of what you need to move on to next. Why slow is actually probably it's less, I think, widely used now, but why slow is very much so the first one out there. Like why slow was the first big one. This is the performance rules that made it into Steve's first book, with a few additions since then. But it does the same thing. You run this as an extension in your browser, and it gives you grades on a whole bunch of different things and tells you where you need to improve. Rule-based metrics are awesome for, again, several things. First off, they're pretty easy to understand. Like, we've all been to school, so we all know what an A or a B or an F or a C or a D means. It's easy to see that an F is a bad thing, and we should probably do something about that. It's also awesome for a checklist of basic optimizations. The things that a YSlow is reporting or PageSpeed is reporting are things that you should probably be doing. They're not necessarily, the risk is that I think that there are times where people feel compelled to, like, that's what they set out to do. I want to get 100 score on PageSpeed, or I want to get an A in YSlow. And while that's okay, you can't necessarily consider it done at the end of that. Like, that isn't enough to ensure that you've given a good performing site. It's enough to make sure you've got the basics in place, but you still need to be going beyond that. Because again, it has very little direct connection to the user experience. It's a little more than rule-based, I would say. But you can check all of these items off on your checklist and still have a site that doesn't feel very fast. It's totally possible to do. I've done it. So again, on our little continuum, I put them a little closer to the user than quantity-based, but not very much. Milestone timings. Milestone timings are timings of a very specific milestone in the course of a page load. Milestone timings is a huge, big bucket that you can throw a whole bunch of different metrics in. Some of the more common ones are things like start rendering. When does stuff start showing up on a page? So that if we're looking at our web page test results, the start rendering is this green bar here. You can see that's where things start to show up on the build right page, is right about, 0.5 something or another seconds. That's a milestone timing. DOM content loaded, how long does it take? That's when the scripts start running executed to the DOM content loaded event. When does that fire and how long does that take? The start of this pink bar is when that fires. The thickness of the pink bar is showing us how long it takes to execute those scripts. This isn't so bad. Sometimes you see a pink bar that's like this, which means that they're doing, like, if you've ever used anything, take an Angular built site or anything using a client-side MVC and throw it in web page test and look for this pink bar, and you get something like, it's this huge, massive block, because it has a lot of work to do. But this is another milestone that you could be watching for this particular event. You could watch for when the document is complete. When does it fire the onload event? So in this case, that gets us 0.2, 0.2, 2.3, somewhere around there, that blue bar. You could also look for fully loaded, which is what we've historically done a lot of. When is everything's basically done? The page is there, everything's there, the progress bar is stopped spinning inside of the browser, and that's basically the end of the waterfall. So at 3 point something or another seconds.
Would that apply, like, if you had, sort of the new, loading images on scroll? How does those are there?
It doesn't.
Okay.
It doesn't. So your loaded event everything's going to fire before then, because that's not triggered until a user scrolls down the page, and it's a user behavior that's triggering it.
Okay.
So it's not going to be tracked in this.
Does it get added?
Not inside of web page test. If you're using something like a browser dev tool, like
Okay.
Chrome DevTools or Firefox DevTools, as you scroll, you'll start to see it add to the waterfall. But it doesn't change when that event fires. That all those events and stuff are going to fire based on that, because that's, as far as it knows at the time, the page is complete. It's only when the user does something that it triggers an additional behavior, and the browser has no way of knowing that's going to happen. These are some of the more common ones. There's a ton. There's this navigation timing API, which you can see fires. You have all sorts of different timings that you can get into here. You can get granular about when does the domain lookup start and end. DOM load event start, load event end, DOM interactive, connect end. There's all sorts of different things you could clue in on here if you wanted to. Milestone timings are pretty easy to track. It doesn't take Most tools use them. It's easy to communicate for the most part. Most of them are. Saying something is visually complete is pretty easy to explain. And you can use your own custom user timings to say, for example, Twitter is really into time to first tweet. Like, how long does it take for the first tweet to display on the page? That's a very specific business metric, and you can get that way with user timings. You can fire a user timing when an image loads, or a user timing when, I don't know, when your carousel initializes, whatever it happens to be. The only con is that it's a limited representation of the user experience. It's not completely removed. So it tells you a lot more than weights or quantity or rule-based metrics do. But the problem with milestone timings is that, so does anybody read books? Really? There's laughter? Okay, thank you. Thank you, the two of you who do this. Come on. I love reading. Anyway, so imagine you did read books. Did anybody read books back in school? Like, you've done it before? Okay, wow. Once upon a time when you read books because you were forced to by your parents or school teachers, if you ever did you were asked to maybe do like a book review or a book report, right, on this book, and let's say it's something awful. Let's go with the Shakespeare thing because I don't like Shakespeare. So it's Shakespeare, right? And you've got to read Hamlet, and you've got to provide a book report on Hamlet. And you wanted to do the book report based on one page or one paragraph of Hamlet. So you turn to page 32 and you select the fourth paragraph. You read that paragraph and you're like, that's what I'm going to do my book report based on. That's what a milestone timing kind of is, because it's saying like the experience of loading a page is this long, drawn-out thing that takes over the course of several seconds, and you're trying to define the experience by one fraction, like 1 millisecond representation over the course of that process. You don't have a very complete picture of what it feels like. Now, if you start to pair these together, you start to pair like time to first byte with start render with visually complete, for example, you start to give yourself a little bit better of a representation of what the experience is like, but you have to put a bunch of them together to be able to do it. So milestone timings are limited because they're a single point in time trying to define what an entire experience is that's over the course of several seconds. Can't believe the book thing fell that badly off track. I thought that would be something we could all relate to. A movie, maybe? It's like defining the Avengers by one scene. No, you could probably do that. You could certainly do it with a Michael Bay movie. Milestone timings, I'm giving them 2 dots because there's a range here. Milestone timings, depending on what you're using or how many of you are using, it could be fairly removed from the user experience, or it could give you a decent representation of it. It starts to get you a lot closer. This is a step in the right direction for what we're looking for from that perspective. And now we get to speed index. Speed index is a representation of the perceived load of a page from start to finish. It's going to become very apparent in a second, the con of speed index, I think. So let's go back to our wired example. If we did quantity-based, we saw that wouldn't really change much. If we did milestone, we could start getting a picture. If we did like the fully loaded or visually complete, it actually wouldn't tell us much, right? Because they'd get to be fully loaded and visually complete almost at the same time as each other. But if we started to pair things with start render or time to first byte plus visually complete, we'd start to see that it's a lot earlier when it starts showing things up on the screen, right? So you could start to get there. Speed index is actually looking at that entire process. So from start to finish, as the film strip fills in, as the page starts to put things up onto the screen, how quickly does the majority of the content get displayed on the screen for you? And it tries to quantify that with a number. So like golf, the lower the speed index score, the better. So if you're saying that the bottom here might have a speed index of, I don't know, like 900, 800, it probably says in the article, I'm just winging it. And the top one may have a speed index of like 2,000 or 3,000, a significantly higher speed index because it takes a lot longer to paint things onto the screen. Does that make any sense? Kind of? Yeah, to get the majority of the stuff above the fold. I hate saying that, but it works in this thing. There is no fold. I slap myself with a ruler every time after I'm done with these presentations. Yeah, to get the stuff above, that's initially above the bottom of the screen of your device or monitor to display. It's a representation of how quickly that comes onto the screen. It's recorded in web page tests. They give you this nice little speed index thing. By the way, speed index on Maker series is really nice. 676 is quite good. Yeah, so good job on that. What? Even with an F. Even with, I was going to say, and we did like the page speeds. This is a great example. The page speed scores gave like a 64 and a 70 something, and they said you guys got a lot to improve on here. But you know, when you actually look at the perceived experience, but when you looked at the actual perceived experience, like what it feels like to load the page, it's actually really nice. 676 is an awesome speed index. That's fantastic. So web page test does this. Pat Meenan, the guy who primarily is, he's kind of the genius behind web page test, and he does a lot of performance stuff. Pat's a brilliant guy, very nice too. Talking about humble contest, he'd probably win. He worked on a RUM thing, so real user metrics. It's a little JavaScript snippet that attempts to calculate what the speed index is. It's accurate to an extent. It's the best that they can do. It depends on the browser and how they fire the events. Speed index is really calculated by looking at a video of a page load. You know, looking at how the page is visually filling in and percentages and things like that. He's trying to do it by timings. So he got as close as he could. In some browsers like Chrome, it works pretty well. In other browsers like IE and things like that, it's not nearly as nice. And in older browsers, it's pretty inaccurate. But it's an option for tracking. But that's really it at the moment. Paul Irish just gave a talk at FluentConf this last week. And at the end, he tried to demo something that failed. Live demos suck. But he tried to do this live demo of this cool new thing in Chrome where they were doing, basically, you could have it record, and it took screenshots of the pages it was recording inside of DevTools. I didn't get confirmation from him on this, but I'm just going to hypothesize because it seems like a logical next step because they've got the video, they've got the frames. I'm pretty sure we're going to see speed index shortly after that within the DevTools of Chrome because that's what they need is those sort of things. I may be oversimplifying it, so don't quote me on this or get me in trouble with Paul, but I tried to text him quick, but he didn't get back to me yet, or maybe he did now. But I think you'll see it maybe in Chrome pretty soon, and I know other people are looking at it because it's a very accurate representation of the page experience. So speed index is super closely tied to the user experience. It's awesome. You can't get much better than that at the moment with anything else that you're going to do. And that's why everybody talks about it so much about like, this is what your performance budget should be, this is what we should be, you know, don't talk about fully loaded or page weight or anything, talk about speed index, but you know what, speed index actually sucks at a few things too. It's really difficult to communicate. There's probably, I will be stunned if there is not somebody here who is still sitting there like, I don't exactly know what the heck he's talking about with this. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. It took me, I feel like I'm okay at this performance stuff. I read Pat's post like 7 times, 8 times before I was like, oh, that's what it is. Like, it was the longest time before I had any clue what was going on. So if you are sitting there like, Tim, I have no idea what you're talking about with this thing, that's fine. I didn't know either for a very, very, very long time. And I was embarrassed, which you don't have to be. But it's very difficult to communicate and explain. Like, try to explain what speed index is to people. As long as they buy that first line, like it's a representation of how the perceived performance, you're good. But if anybody asks details beyond that, then you're lost. There's no way to do it. And it's very limited tracking. You have to use web page test or a tool based on web page test, or the RUM JavaScript snippet. But then your accuracy is not quite, as good. It gets you close, I suppose. But you're going to want to back it up with other things. So hopefully that improves. But at the moment, you don't have a lot of options for recording this. So on our little user continuum, speed index gets put over there. But understand that there's still faults there. There's still issues with speed index. When you look at it from this perspective, it's easy to see why everybody's gravitating towards speed index as a metric that they are commonly using for performance tracking and performance budgeting. But hopefully with all of those limitations in place, you also see that there are some serious problems with things like that. We're going to get into this in the next section. But for me, I think that a strong performance budget process, a strong performance budget strategy, includes multiple of these different kinds of timings. I think you're backing these things up because I think that they all are the things that they're good at. You take advantage of what they're good at in your process, and you fill in the gaps of the limitations of the others by combining them together. And we'll talk about specifically how you do that and how you move from one to the next in the next group. Questions on the metric timing group things? Does anybody say, Tim, those metric groups don't make any sense? No? Does that work okay? Like, I made those up and I was like, this is what I'm gonna do. This is the official thing now. Anybody like really like the speed index thing doesn't make any sense at all and you wanna throw something at me or walk out right now? No, that's good. Nobody's asleep, which is good. There is coffee if you are gonna doze off. It's fine. I'd nap if I could, but I have to talk. Makes it harder, yeah.
Speed index is only in web page tests, but you think hypothetically Chrome
Hypothetically.
may be, so I mean, how much?
Tim Kadlec has officially reported that Chrome dev tools that he does not work on are going to record this. Yeah, I'm pretty sure it'll be
okay,
coming.
but I'm just trying to think about, because I think the challenge we have like with web page tests is we spend 6 months building a site and we can't, absent of bringing this inside our organization and installing it locally, I'm not sure how that would even work.
The local testing.
But so what typically what happens is, once the site launches, unfortunately we don't do a lot of ongoing, level of performance, just enhancement. So I'm just trying to think, well, we just spent 6 months building the site, now we're gonna test it, oh crap, it's horrible. Now we have to go back and beg for more money to fix it, which we can't test again until it's live again.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, so it seems like Chrome dev tools could potentially start filling in the gap where we can start testing those in our environments inside the firewall.
Yeah, it could potentially do that, or supplementing it with that script. It's a little bit, it's like maybe 20K, if that. It's a very small script of JavaScript.
But it only does speed index.
The script,
okay.
yes. You could pair that with like a navigation timing thing. I've got a super simple one later that I'll show. But you could pair it with a navigation timing thing to give you like speed index and a few other metrics. In fact, in the 2 sections from now, I strongly make the case that you should do something like that in your dev environment. Do you have a staging environment that you're pushing stuff up to during the development, or like is it all locally on your machines? Oh, within the firewall. So yeah, you definitely need your own private instance or something there.
I swear it said like PHP. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. I swear it said like PHP or
it is.
.NET or something like that.
What do you got against PHP? No, PHP is awesome.
Which we don't have any sort of. Yeah. I don't think that we have any affordance or.
Yeah. It's
unless it's Java or .NET. I don't think.
Keep an eye on 2 things. First off, they also added the ability for you to spin up instances on already defined Amazon AWS things. So you could actually potentially spin up a Amazon thing and test and then spin it back down. That's an option. Keep an eye on using web page test, a book coming out from O'Reilly through Marcel Duran, Andy Davies, and I'm blanking on the third person, and that makes me feel very bad. But they're writing a book all about using it, and they're going to have at least a full chapter about the installation and stuff. And I know as part of that, they're also diving into some of that because Pat is very aware, acutely aware, that web page test, it's fantastic, but the private installation, which provides so much more value. There's also features you can only get in the private instance. It's such a mess to set up. It's a mess to set up the testing agents. It's confined to certain platforms. Like they're acutely aware of it. I know they're trying to find ways to make that potentially easier. They're always looking at ways to make that work for a wider audience. Read the book, see if there's anything in the book that would help potentially with your situation there. Hopefully there will be. It's not, I don't know when exactly it's coming out. It's an early release, so I think you can get early access to it right now, but.
That's O'Reilly.
Yes, O'Reilly, yeah. But that's one of my big things. I love web page tests, but I would love to see the private installation become a lot easier, and plug and play would be awesome.
How do you measure and use speed index earlier in the process, before it gets to the full development? Do you prototype things out, or is there a way to use that?
How do you measure a speed index? I suppose I should be repeating for the live stream people. I think everybody in here can hear the questions. Sorry, live stream people, if you can't. Oh, okay, good. Yeah, so I think that you do get into the prototypes as early as possible. Like getting into the browser as quickly as you can is going to let you, not just speed index, but really anything other than like some of the quantity stuff, like the weight, you can probably guess those fairly well. But anything milestone timing or speed index, the only way to do it is to actually have it running in a browser instead of inside of Photoshop or Sketch or whatever that happens to be that you're using. I am all for getting prototypes out there as early as possible, even if they're half-baked prototypes. As soon as it's in a browser, you can start to feel performance and test performance and be watching performance as you make the changes within your HTML and CSS and JavaScript. Up to that point, it's all hypothetical. It's just guessing at what you think it's going to be kind of. So yeah, I'm all about getting it into the browser as early as possible and onto a variety of different devices as early as possible, which is, by the way, one of the things with that project that when we redid it, that was one of the things we made a point of doing, is getting into the browser quickly and having regular powwows with like 10 random devices on the table with it fired up, so we could say really quickly, oh wait, this behavior here actually is horrible on, this $50 prepaid Android device. Maybe we should rethink our approach here or things like that. Yes, all for it. Anything else? Yeah, you're looking iffy.
Performance budgets to me is the entire user experience from when they hit your page to when they leave your page.
Mm-hmm.
So that could be any range of time. It
Mm-hmm.
could be hours, it could be seconds, it could
Mm-hmm.
be pounds, it could be whatever. So that performance budget, everything we talked about now has been microscopic measurement now,
Mm-hmm.
and tools of hitting one page, like the build right page.
Mm-hmm.
But the performance should be the experience on that site. So I'm thinking something like in Google Analytics, you can see how people travel through your website,
Mm-hmm.
and taking that type of measurement, how they travel through your website,
Mm-hmm.
and then into their experience on the website, what that performance measurement should be.
I would like to hug you, actually, but that would be awkward.
I am there, sorry.
No, that's yet another reason why it's great to be on the live stream instead of here threatening to hug. No, so I totally agree with you. In fact, I think that like if we all get like, I don't know if maybe it's a little like the hippie-ish thing, but whatever. I'm down with we're all in this together, like the performance thing. So the idea, honestly, when you look at performance, and you look at the goal of performance, the goal is to improve the user experience. The goal is to make sure that the person who is accessing your site can accomplish what they came to do on your site as quickly and seamlessly as possible with as little friction as possible. That, to me, is the ultimate goal of performance. And when you look at performance in that perspective, it changes the entire way we talk about it. Because it's when you're looking at it like it's about task completion, it is very clearly not a developer job entirely. It is, the designers have to get involved, your information architects are involved in how quickly people can, perform tasks in terms of how you're constructing the page and the navigation and the flows that they're moving through the page or through the site to get to that content. There's studies that back this up. The UIE, interface engineering people, Jared Spool's group, did a study like 2002, 2003, I think, where they had people sit down and run through a variety of e-commerce sites with specific tasks that they had to complete. And at the end of this, they asked everybody all sorts of questions about the sites. How was it to use? What was your feelings? How fast was it? Was one of the questions. The really interesting thing about that was that the sites that they rated as the fastest sites, actually in terms of raw performance, like just page load time and things like that, one of the ones that they ranked as like the fastest or second fastest, I want to say it was the highest, was actually the worst performing site from a performance standpoint of all of them. It was obnoxiously slow. But the information architecture and design was set up in a way that it was very easy and seamless for them to complete the task. They completed it very quickly with no frustration, and because of that, it felt very fast to them. Because they were able to accomplish what they wanted to accomplish without getting frustrated and lost along the way.
So intuitive interfaces equals better performance?
Yes. Performance is design, absolutely. From a performance budget, like taking it back, so I totally agree with you on this. Like, and I think we're just starting to kind of unearth that. That's very new terrain. I think that's something that, Brad's talked about a little bit. I've talked about a little bit. Laura's talked about it. Steve Sodders is just now giving a presentation like yesterday that is starting to get into that area. I think that's something that it took some of us, maybe Jared Spool because he did the study. Maybe he was way ahead of us all. But I think it's one of those things that it took some of us to kind of get to that point where we're like, oh, wait a minute, this is all kind of circling back. So I don't really have a great example for that because I agree with you. Like, at the end of the day, what matters is if they came to buy a product, that's what I want to know. I want to know from when they landed on whatever their landing page was to when they hit checkout or completed their thing, how long did it take them to do that? And I think that's where we have to turn to traditional information architecture things and analysis that goes into like how many steps along the way were they doing. From a performance budget perspective, I think you still have to look at that individual page because that first experience is huge. How quickly those pages still comes into play, but it's certainly not independent of how you've set up and designed the site. They work in conjunction with each other. So I would say that you have the performance budget helping you inform the design and the development, but you still absolutely need to be watching to see what, in terms of the actual analytics, what paths are people taking, where are they getting lost, where are they getting stuck on, what things are taking too long for them to do that, and how do I make the path from point A to point B shorter, quicker, and more frictionless.
You've got 4 types of metrics.
Mm-hmm.
Could there be an intangible metric?
There could be.
That would be that.
There could be. Maybe I need a 5th bucket. I love this topic. I'll be quite open with you. It's just a topic that I don't have a specific recommendation for yet. It's one of those areas that I'm diving into, but I can't tell you exactly what I think works there because it's still something I'm totally fleshing out. So anybody live streaming or anybody here, if you have a information architecture background or something that would help with that sort of thing and you want to, tweet it out, email me, whatever you got to do, but I write a blog post. But I think that's an area that's ripe for more discussion.
It seems like Speed Index is trying to get at that. Right?
It's trying to, which is why it's such a step in the right direction, because it's trying to shift from specific points in time to the perception over a period of time.
Right.
The limitation is it's a period of time within a page versus a period of time within the site. Yeah, so it's trying to do it within the confines of a single page versus the entire site.
Maybe that's where Paul actually is going, is eventually that next step, since they are with Google Analytics, they're measuring that experience from
maybe.
to the site. Maybe they'll tie all that in together.
They could.
Take the average experience.
That might be the next step. But I think so. I think the performance budget stuff at the moment, the role that it plays is helping you within that the experiences along the way that make it the wider one. But you still have to back it up by looking at the wider one and paying attention to it. So, and I won't hug you. I just got really emotional for a moment. So it was nice.
Thanks for watching the Build Right Maker Series. Check out our other videos from industry leaders at buildright.io. Or even better, buy a ticket and attend in person.